Lambeth and Lament, prayer and other instruments of communion. As the British Empire expanded and reached its height in the early 20th century, it brought the Church of England with it wherever it went, through the work of chaplains and especially missionary societies like the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts, the SPG, and the Church Missionary Society, CMS. When the Episcopal Church in the United States became an autonomous church, it also became the first province of the global Anglican Communion. In fact, when the Episcopal Church became autonomous, it essentially formed the Anglican Communion. And then when the colonial system broke down after the Second World War, more indigenous leaders emerged and more Anglican provinces came into being and came into their own. The Anglican Communion decided not to have a centralized authority like the Roman Catholic Church and some of the Eastern Orthodox churches, but rather a dispersed authority. With this dispersed authority, the communion upheld and formed instruments of communion to help strengthen the bonds of affection among the different provinces. The four instruments of communion are the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Primates Meeting, the Anglican Consultative Council, and the Lambeth Conference. Anglican identity emerges from connection to these four instruments of the Anglican Communion. First, Archbishop of Canterbury. The Archbishop of Canterbury is the focus of unity for the other three instruments. He calls the Lambeth Conference, he convenes the Primates Meeting, and he presides as the president of the Anglican Consultative Council. He is considered the spiritual leader of the entire Anglican Communion, and when it comes to his relationship with other bishops and other primates of the provinces, he is the primus inter pares, the first among equals. And he is the primate of all England and the Diocesan Bishop of Canterbury. And he takes the lead in respect to Anglican relationships with other Christian churches in the United Kingdom and abroad. And likewise, he leads when it comes to Anglican relationships with other faith communities, like the Muslim community or the Jewish community or the Hindu community. Primates Meeting. The primates of the Anglican Communion are the chief archbishops or presiding bishops or moderators or chief pastors of the 42 provinces. The Archbishop of Canterbury convenes the meetings, and sessions are chaired by different primates. And the primates have no authority as a body. The Primates Meeting was established in 1978 by the then Archbishop of Canterbury, Donald Cogan, as an opportunity for, quote, leisurely thought, prayer, and deep consultation. An opportunity for leisurely thought, prayer, and deep consultation. The ACC, the Anglican Consultative Council. Now, the role of the ACC is to facilitate cooperative work among the Anglican churches, to exchange information between provinces and churches, to help coordinate common action, to advise on the organization and structure of the communion, and to seek to develop common policies with respect to the world mission of the church, including ecumenical matters. Remember the 5 marks of mission in the Anglican Mission Lecture. Those were decided upon by the ACC. The ACC can be seen as the most representative body of gathered Anglicans among the instruments of communion. All the other instruments are bishops, right? The Archbishop of Canterbury, Primates Meeting, the chief pastors, the chief bishops of a province, and then Lambeth is all bishops. The ACC is composed of laity, archbishops, bishops, priests, and deacons from the Anglican provinces, which each send about 2 or 3 representatives. And the meetings are held around the world approximately every 3 years. Finally, Lambeth. Since 1867, the Lambeth Conference has generally taken place once every decade or so. And at the conference, bishops gather at the invitation of the Archbishop of Canterbury, to pray together, to study the Bible, and to hear the struggles and joys that each bishop experiences in their local contexts, and to address the issues facing the whole world. Now, the unwitting architect of the Lambeth Conference, and some say of the entire Anglican Communion, was Bishop John Colenso, Bishop of the Diocese of Natal in South Africa in the 1860s. Colenso argued that polygamy should not be a barrier to baptism and that baptized men should not be forced to separate from their wives, which would likely result in social and economic destitution for several women and children. Also, while translating the scriptures into the Zulu language and understanding Christianity in a whole new way in light of Zulu culture, Colenso argued that many stories in the Hebrew scriptures ought to be understood non-literally, as myths. And he scoffed at the idea of a loving God condemning anyone to eternal punishment. A lot of those ideas of Colenso are pretty popular today, but at the time, in 1863, he was considered a heretic by the church in South Africa. At this time, several overseas bishops asked the Archbishop of Canterbury, Charles Longley, to address this controversy, and in 1867, the Archbishop called the first Lambeth Conference. Here's a picture of the first Lambeth Conference the bishops gathered. And it was a meeting held at Lambeth Palace in London. It was not until 1988 that Colenso's views were finally adopted, while also upholding monogamy as the ideal. However, 10 years after 1988, after this 121-year-old debate about human sexuality finally came to a resolution, a new debate about human sexuality emerged when the bishops passed Lambeth Resolution 110, which rejected homosexual practice as incompatible with Scripture. Now, in the meantime, the Episcopal Church had adopted a resolution back in 1979, which stated that, quote, homosexual persons are children of God who have a full and equal claim with other persons upon the love, acceptance, and pastoral concern and care of the Church. And in 1977, the first openly lesbian priest was ordained, the Reverend Ellen Barrett. In 1989, the first openly gay priest was ordained, Reverend Robert Williams. Ellen Barrett was ordained in New York by Bishop Paul Moore, and Robert Williams was ordained by Bishop John Shelby Spong in Newark, New Jersey. In 1994, General Convention adopted a resolution that stated, no one shall be denied access to the selection process for ordination in this church because of race, color, ethnic origin, sex, national origin, marital status, sexual orientation, disabilities, or age, except as otherwise specified by these canons. No right to ordination is hereby established. So not everybody has a right to get ordained. It's still a process, but no one shall be denied access to that process of discernment and selection for any of these reasons, including sexual orientation. And this resolution was put to the test when the Reverend Gene Robinson was elected Bishop of New Hampshire in June of 2003 and then consecrated in November of 2003. The consecration of Bishop Gene Robinson led to schism and a breakdown in relationships among bishops and leaders within the Episcopal Church and within the entire Anglican Communion, as well as within the entire Christian community. This was not a storm in a teapot. This had ripple effects across all of Christendom. The decision to consecrate Gene Robinson flew in the face of Lambeth Resolution 110. In response to Robinson's consecration, a Lambeth Commission on Communion was appointed by the Anglican Communion and published in 2004 a document called the Windsor Report, which recommended an Anglican covenant for the Anglican Communion. This covenant was ultimately rejected by multiple provinces, including the Church of England itself. The Windsor Report also made a request of the Episcopal Church in paragraph 135 saying, we particularly request a contribution from the Episcopal Church, USA, which explains from within the sources of authority that we as Anglicans have received in Scripture, the apostolic tradition, and reasoned reflection, how a person living in a same-gender union may be considered eligible to lead the flock of Christ. As we see it, such a reasoned response will have an important contribution to make in the ongoing discussion. So in 2005, the Episcopal Church responded to this request by publishing a document titled To Set Our Hope on Christ, a response to the invitation of Windsor Report, paragraph 135. And this document explains the Church's position of full inclusion, using Scripture and tradition and reasoned reflection. I strongly recommend that every Episcopalian and every Anglican read this document. During this time, Episcopal parishes and dioceses broke off from the Episcopal Church and eventually formed the ACNA, the Anglican Church in North America, which is not recognized by the Archbishop of Canterbury as part of the Anglican Communion. Those bishops are not invited to Lambeth. However, ACNA bishops are part of GAFCON, the Global Anglican Future Conference, which is a series of conferences of conservative Anglican bishops that started meeting in 2008. Their first meeting was in Jerusalem, shown in this picture here. The majority of Anglicans within the Global Communion do not agree with the Episcopal Church's decision to consecrate Gene Robinson. In 2008, Bishop Gene Robinson was not invited to the Lambeth Conference, although all other bishops in the Anglican Communion were invited. After consecrating Gene Robinson, the Episcopal Church decided to put a moratorium on consecrating openly gay and lesbian bishops. But at the General Convention in 2009 in Anaheim, the Church voted to lift the moratorium. And I attended that convention. And I remember hearing Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, preaching to the deputies and the bishops and deputies and really pleading with the Episcopal Church not to lift the moratorium. But the Episcopal Church did lift the moratorium. And in 2010, Bishop Mary Glasspool of Los Angeles, the first openly lesbian bishop, was consecrated. And I feel particularly connected to her consecration because she ordained me to the priesthood in January of 2014. And soon after she ordained me, she asked me to bless her, which was a tremendous honor and very humbling. She now serves as assistant bishop in New York. In 2015, the Episcopal Church affirmed same-sex blessings and rites, and in 2016, the primates meeting sanctioned the Episcopal Church for 3 years. The Episcopal Church remained part of the Anglican Communion, but was not allowed to have representation in the Anglican Consultative Council or to serve in any official leadership position or role in the Anglican Communion for 3 years. Those sanctions expired in 2019. And in 2022, the bishops gathered again for the Lambeth Conference. And at this conference, they talked about different calls on the environment, calls on racial justice, and calls on human dignity, which addressed Lambeth Resolution 110. After considerable conversation about Lambeth 110, Justin Welby wrote the following in a letter to all the bishops of the Communion, in which he said, "Given the deep differences that exist within the Communion over same-sex marriage and human sexuality, I thought it important to set down what is the case. I write, therefore, to affirm that the validity of the resolution passed at the Lambeth Conference 1998, 110, is not in doubt, and that whole resolution is still in existence. The call states that many provinces, and I think we need to acknowledge it's the majority, continue to affirm that same-gender marriage is not permissible. The call also states that other provinces have blessed and welcomed same-sex union/marriage after careful theological reflection and a process of reception. What is also clear is that Lambeth 110 itself continues to be a source of pain, anxiety, and contention among us. That has been very clear over the course of this Lambeth conference. That is also part of the current reality of our communion. So he's just naming the reality that there is division and disagreement when it comes to this resolution. He then says, to be reconciled to one another across such divides is not something we can achieve by ourselves. That is why, as we continue to reflect on 1 Peter, which was their text during Lambeth 2022, that is why I pray that we turn our gaze towards Christ, who alone has the power to reconcile us to God and to one another. And that leads us to the instrument of communion that flows through all of these instruments, and that is prayer. Although it may sound trite, the ultimate instrument of communion that can strengthen the bonds of affection between member churches and provinces is prayer. That is also the sine qua non practice that forms and informs one's identity as an Episcopalian and as an Anglican. The practice of common prayer. And that's why throughout this course, we have been praying and then reflecting on different forms of prayer, using the 1549 matins, praying with the poetry of metaphysical poets like George Herbert and John Donne, praying with the hymns of Charles Wesley, praying in the ancient and medieval way described by the author of The Cloud of Unknowing, the English author of The Cloud of Unknowing, who was describing a way that English monks prayed before the monasteries were dissolved. And now praying for the provinces of the Anglican Communion. As we've been learning about these different prayers, we have discovered how the Anglican tradition creates space and even invites us to bring our honest concerns and questions and confusions and frustrations and even anger to God in prayer. George Herbert, in one of his poems titled Artillery, says, "God dost deign to enter combat with us and to contest with his own clay." And George Herbert himself called prayer the engine against the Almighty, and reversed thunder, and the Christ side-piercing spear. Remember, even the Cloud of Unknowing author used the imagery of a spear piercing the heavens in reference to our prayers. Charles Wesley, remember, in Jesus, Lover of my soul, cried out, "Wilt thou not regard my call? Wilt thou not accept my prayer?" A powerfully honest lament that is often omitted from hymnals because it is so raw. And speaking of being raw, C.S. Lewis, in A Grief Observed, asks God, "Are you a cruel clown? Are you a cosmic sadist? Are you an eternal vivisector?" Disturbingly honest questions. Desmond Tutu asks, "Why, O God, is there so much suffering, such needless suffering?" Although there are many theodicies, many defenses of God's righteousness and God's power in light of suffering, I personally find the most compelling theodicies to be theodicies of honest prayer and lament, what I call a theodical spirituality, in which questions about suffering are brought to God in prayer and a divine response is experienced. And we can see that in all these examples. C.S. Lewis, who was a theologian and wrote about theodicy and the problem of pain, theodicy being a defense of God, theos dike, a defense of God in the face of suffering. He defended God in the face of suffering, but it wasn't until he experienced profound personal suffering that he entered into a theodical spirituality in which he hurled those questions before God in prayer and experienced a response, which you see expressed in subtle ways throughout A Grief Observed. Malcolm Boyd, a poet who I also had the chance to meet right before my ordination to the diaconate, offers some honest prayers in his famous book, Are You Running With Me, Jesus? He's an openly gay priest and poet. In one of his poems, he says, I'm crying and shouting inside tonight, Jesus, and I'm feeling completely alone. There are many other expressions like that. And you hear him bringing his questions of suffering to God in prayer, and you also see how he receives a divine response. So as we read through C.S. Lewis's Grief Observed and Desmond Tutu and his litany in an African prayer book, the question is, what answers do you see them receiving from God in response to their laments and their questions of suffering, which they bring to God in prayer? And what answers or responses from God do you receive when you lament and bring your own questions of suffering to God, just like George Herbert and Charles Wesley and C.S. Lewis and Desmond Tutu and Malcolm Boyd? Finally, how do you think honest prayers of lament, which bring questions of suffering to God, how do you think they might offer healing in the face of the Anglican Communion's current challenges and divisions, especially the division around questions of human sexuality, but also as we reckon with our history of racism and colonialism, especially as the Episcopal Church has a reckoning with our history of racism and colonialism and slavery, these sins that have haunted and plagued most provinces. History of genocide of indigenous peoples, and the current challenges around climate change and economic inequality and immigration and war, violence, scapegoating, anti-Semitism. How might honest prayers of lament offer healing in the face of all of these enormous challenges and divisions? And how can we bring this quintessential practice that forms our Anglican identity into this current set of challenges which we now face?